Human behavior is often more complicated than it appears. People usually expect someone who has been threatened or held against their will to feel fear, anger, or hatred towards the person responsible. However, there are rare situations in which the opposite seems to happen. Some victims begin to develop sympathy, trust, or even emotional attachment towards the people who have harmed them. This surprising reaction is known as Stockholm Syndrome. Although it is widely discussed in books, films, and the media, it is often misunderstood. Learning about this psychological response can help people better understand how the human mind tries to cope with extreme stress and frightening situations. The term Stockholm Syndrome originated in Sweden in 1973 after a bank robbery in the city of Stockholm. During the robbery, several employees were held hostage inside the bank for almost a week. Although they experienced fear and uncertainty, some of the hostages later showed sympathy for the robbers and even defended them after they were rescued. Many people found this reaction difficult to understand. As psychologists examined the case, the expression Stockholm Syndrome gradually became popular and was later used to describe similar situations in other parts of the world. It is important to understand that Stockholm Syndrome is not an official mental illness. Instead, it is considered a possible psychological response that may appear under very stressful conditions. Not every hostage or victim develops these feelings. In fact, many people never experience them at all. Experts continue to discuss why the syndrome appears in some situations, but not in others. Because every person reacts differently to fear and trauma, there is still much to learn about this complex behavior. One possible explanation is that the human brain tries to increase the chances of survival. When a victim has no realistic opportunity to escape, building a peaceful relationship with the captor may reduce the immediate danger. Even small acts of kindness, such as offering food, allowing conversation, or showing concern, can seem very meaningful in a frightening environment. As a result, the victim may begin to focus on these positive actions while paying less attention to the threats and violence. This emotional response is not usually a conscious choice, but rather a way for the mind to cope with an overwhelming situation. Another factor is isolation. Victims are often separated from their families, friends, and other sources of emotional support. Over time, the captor may become the only person with whom they can communicate. Since human beings naturally seek connection with others, some victims gradually develop emotional bonds with the very person who controls their lives. These feelings can become stronger if the period of captivity lasts for days, weeks, or even months. The longer the isolation continues, the more difficult it may become to maintain an objective view of the situation. Fear also plays a significant role. Victims often live with constant uncertainty because they do not know what will happen next. If the captor decides not to use violence during a particular moment, the victim may see this as an act of mercy rather than as normal behavior. Small gestures of kindness can therefore seem much more important than they would under ordinary circumstances. This unusual way of thinking develops because the victim is trying to survive in an environment where every decision may have serious consequences. Stockholm Syndrome is most commonly associated with hostage situations, but similar emotional responses have sometimes been observed in other forms of abuse. For example, people trapped in controlling relationships may continue to defend an abusive partner despite repeated harm. In some cases, victims may believe that the abuse is their own fault, or hope that the other person will eventually change. Family members or friends often struggle to understand why someone does not simply leave the relationship. However, emotional dependence, fear, and psychological pressure can make such decisions far more complicated than they appear from the outside. The media has played an important role in making Stockholm Syndrome widely known. Films, television programs, novels, and documentaries have explored the idea in many different ways. Some stories accurately present the emotional confusion experienced by victims, while others exaggerate the condition to create dramatic entertainment. As a result, many people have developed incorrect ideas about what Stockholm Syndrome actually involves. It is therefore important to rely on scientific research rather than fictional stories when trying to understand this psychological response. Modern psychologists continue to study trauma and the ways people react to extreme danger.
Some researchers question whether Stockholm Syndrome should be treated as a separate condition because the scientific evidence is still limited. They argue that the emotional attachment seen in certain cases may simply be one of many possible responses to severe trauma. Others believe that the concept remains useful because it helps explain behavior that might otherwise seem impossible to understand. Although opinions differ, most experts agree that every case should be examined carefully rather than judged according to a single theory.
Supporting victims after they have escaped from dangerous situations is extremely important. Recovery often takes time because many people continue to experience fear, anxiety, guilt, or confusion long after the event has ended. Professional counseling can help victims understand their emotions and gradually rebuild their confidence. Support from family members and close friends is also valuable during the healing process. Instead of criticizing victims for their reactions, people should show patience and understanding, recognizing that traumatic experiences can affect the mind in unexpected ways. Education also has an important role to play. Learning about psychological responses to trauma can reduce harmful stereotypes and encourage greater compassion. Many people wrongly assume that victims always behave in predictable ways. In reality, human behavior under extreme stress is often complex and difficult to explain. By increasing public awareness, schools, healthcare professionals, and the media can help create a more informed society that treats victims with respect rather than misunderstanding. Stockholm Syndrome also reminds us of the remarkable ability of the human mind to adapt. In dangerous situations, the brain may develop unusual coping strategies that seem irrational from the outside, but serve an important purpose during the crisis. These responses demonstrate both the strength and the vulnerability of human psychology. They show that survival sometimes depends not only on physical endurance, but also on emotional adaptation to extremely challenging circumstances. At the same time, it is essential to avoid using the term carelessly. In everyday conversations, people sometimes describe any unhealthy relationship as Stockholm Syndrome. This oversimplifies a complicated psychological concept and may lead to confusion. Mental health professionals usually consider many different factors before discussing whether the term is appropriate. Using accurate language helps people understand psychological conditions more clearly and prevents the spread of common misconceptions. Overall, Stockholm Syndrome is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood psychological responses associated with extreme stress and captivity. Although it is relatively rare and remains the subject of scientific discussion, it demonstrates how the human mind can adapt in order to survive frightening situations. Emotional attachment to a captor or abuser may seem difficult to understand, but it often develops through fear, isolation, dependence, and the desire to stay alive. By studying this phenomenon with care and compassion, society can gain a deeper understanding of trauma while offering more effective support to those who have experienced it.